In Neville's framework, change does not begin with effort, repetition, or deliberate action. It begins at the moment an idea is received without resistance and allowed to settle as an assumed fact. Listening does not mean agreement or belief in a conventional sense. It refers to suspending the impulse to analyze, correct, or prepare a response. Letting it lock in names the point at which the mind no longer treats the idea as tentative. Once that point is reached, the idea stops being worked on and instead becomes part of the mental background from which perception and behavior emerge. Neville's claim is not about persuasion or self-improvement. It is about how mental fixation precedes and organizes experience. If understanding depends on cessation of interference, what determines when the mind finally stops adjusting what it has heard? For Neville's model to function, a foundational assumption must be accepted. Consciousness is self-organizing, and instability arises primarily from interference rather than absence of control. The mind, in this view, does not need to be pushed into certainty. It moves towards stability when it is no longer interrupted by habitual doubt and correction. You are asked to notice how often ideas are held provisionally, as if awaiting further confirmation. Neville treats this provisional stance as the source of mental unrest. Listening, therefore, is not passivity, but a deliberate suspension of resistance. An assumption locks in when it is allowed to stand without conditions attached. This requires accepting that the mind can settle without constant supervision. If receptivity rather than effort stabilizes inner states, what patterns of mental resistance keep ideas from ever becoming fixed? Neville's description of imagination and feeling operates as a psychological mechanism rather than a mystical one. Imagination, in his usage, refers to the mind's capacity to hold an internal state as present and normal. Feeling is not emotion or excitement, but the sense of familiarity that accompanies what is accepted as real. When an assumption is entertained repeatedly, it remains hypothetical. When it is accepted, repetition ceases. At that point, the assumption is no longer brought into awareness for evaluation. You can observe that what feels settled rarely demands attention. Neville's mechanism depends on this transition from active consideration to background acceptance. The mind organizes itself around what is no longer questioned. If fixation occurs through familiarity rather than intensity, how does the mind decide which assumptions become familiar enough to stop revisiting? In Neville's framework, discipline is often misunderstood. It is not the act of repeatedly focusing on an idea to make it stronger. Discipline refers to maintaining non-interference once an assumption is accepted. You are asked to notice the tendency to mentally check whether an idea is working or still valid. Each check reopens the assumption and returns it to a provisional state. Discipline, therefore, is the restraint from reopening settled positions. Attention is not directed toward reinforcing the assumption, but away from questioning it. This reframes discipline as subtraction rather than addition. The assumption remains stable because it is not repeatedly exposed to scrutiny. If discipline consists of refusing to interfere, how does the mind learn to recognize when interference has already ended? The internal logic of Neville's model is closed and self-consistent. Inner assumption precedes experience because it structures interpretation, attention, and response. Once an assumption is locked in, behavior aligns with it without conscious effort. This alignment is not imposed. It emerges from coherence between expectation and perception. Neville does not argue that inner states force external events. He argues that experience is filtered and organized through what the mind treats as given. In this logic, causation is not linear but structural. The inner state provides the framework within which events are interpreted and acted upon. If experience follows assumption through coherence rather than force, How does change occur without disrupting the continuity of the system? Neville's model fits within a long history of inner-first explanations of human behavior. Across cultures and philosophical traditions, certainty has been treated as more influential than argument. Beliefs that guide action are rarely those under active debate. They are those absorbed into the background of thought. Neville's contribution lies in articulating this pattern as a cognitive process rather than a doctrine. He reframes certainty as a psychological condition rather than a moral or spiritual one. The emphasis is not on what is believed, but on how belief becomes settled. This continuity suggests that Neville's framework resonates because it describes a familiar human process. If absorbed belief has always guided behavior, what differentiates belief that remains theoretical from belief that organizes action? In Neville's framework, perception does not function as neutral data collection. It operates as feedback. Once an assumption is fixed, perception aligns with it by assigning relevance and meaning accordingly. You can notice that information, consistent with a settled view, requires little effort to accept, while contradictory information loses prominence without being actively resisted. Neville does not claim that contradictions disappear. He claims they no longer organize attention. Experience appears consistent because perception is structured around what is assumed. This makes reality feel stable without requiring conscious enforcement. If perception reinforces assumption rather than testing it, how adaptable can experience remain once fixation has occurred? Agency, as Neville defines it, is exercised before action rather than during it. The decisive point is not behavior, but reception. Choosing what is allowed to enter consciousness without resistance is treated as the primary act of agency. Once an assumption is accepted, behavior follows with minimal deliberation. Responsibility shifts from managing outcomes to managing the conditions under which ideas are received. You are not asked to control events, but to recognize where mental consent is given. Agency concludes when an idea is allowed to settle. After that point, the system operates on its own coherence. If agency is located in listening rather than doing, where does choice actually end? Neville Goddard's thought describes a structured relationship between receptivity, fixation, and experience. Just listen and let it lock in names the transition from active mental management to settled assumption. Receptivity allows entry. Fixation allows stability. Stability organizes perception and behavior without additional effort. Understanding this model does not require agreement or rejection. It requires recognizing how its components relate and support one another. When the structure is clearly seen, the mind does not need to argue with it. What remains is an awareness of how the model explains its own internal coherence, without requiring belief or disbelief to complete the understanding.